Okay, so today we're really diving deep, huh? Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb. We're not just doing the History Channel thing, are we?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
This is about going deeper, using the Enneagram to understand the man behind the science, behind the headlines.
Great. You sent me some fascinating analysis. It really seems like Oppenheimer was a textbook case of a social seven.
And what makes this so interesting, especially looking at the work of someone like Claudio Naranja, is that it challenges the common misconception of sevens as just being, social butterflies.
Totally. It's about core motivations, right?
Yeah,
Not just surface level personality traits.
exactly.
And the analysis you shared, it really connects those social seven tendencies to Oppenheimer's life choices.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about the Manhattan Project, his later activism, the whole spectrum.
It's the story of someone wrestling with these enormous decisions shaping the course of history. And Naranjo's framework, it gives us this whole other layer to understand what might have been going on inside Oppenheimer's head.
Okay, so let's break it down for everyone. One of the big things about social sevens is this incredible idealism, this drive to use their gifts to make the world a better place. How did that show up for Oppenheimer?
Oh, it's woven throughout his entire life. I mean, look at the context of the Manhattan Project, World War II, global turmoil, right? And Oppenheimer, with this social seven desire to create a safer world, he pours himself into this incredibly demanding project.
And I think it's important to highlight, it wasn't just about ending the war. The source material really emphasizes how deeply Oppenheimer believed in the power of science to solve humanity's problems.
Absolutely.
It wasn't just a job for him, it was about this vision of a brighter future.
Right. He genuinely believed he was contributing to a greater good, even if it meant making difficult, maybe even morally ambiguous choices.
Which is another hallmark of the social seven, that ability to justify actions, even tough ones, in service of their ideals.
Yes, and that's a crucial point.
And it leads us to this other big thing with social sevens, which Oppenheimer definitely experienced, their relationship with guilt.
Oh, absolutely. You can't even begin to fathom the weight of those decisions, the sheer devastation unleashed by the atomic bombs. And Oppenheimer, with his strong seven conscience, he grappled with that for the rest of his life.
Yeah, no kidding. And the source material really digs into how that internal struggle played out, you know?
Yeah.
Because it wasn't just about private guilt with Oppenheimer. There's this other layer, this social seven need to be seen as a force for good. And that becomes huge in his story.
Oh, completely. And the analysis really highlights his later activism against nuclear proliferation as a prime example. Like, don't get me wrong, his concern was genuine, but that public stance, it also gave him a way to grapple with that guilt, trying to reconcile the devastation he'd unleashed with this deep desire for a better world.
Almost like, see everyone, I'm still the good guy. I learned from this horrible thing.
Exactly. And that need to be perceived as good, even saintly. Naranja really hits on that in his work on social sevens. This deep-seated need for validation, for reassurance that they're making a positive impact. It's not just ego, it's fundamental to how they operate.
And you know what's interesting? This whole idea of validation, it ties into another thing the source material brings up, Oppenheimer's leadership style on the Manhattan Project.
Yeah.
I mean, talk about intense pressure coordinating, these brilliant minds racing against the clock, the fate of the world hanging in the balance. How did his social seven tendencies play out in that kind of environment?
That's where it gets really fascinating, right? Because the source talks about how, despite all those challenges, Oppenheimer thrived in that leadership role. He wasn't just a genius scientist. He could rally people around a shared vision, inspire them to push boundaries.
Which makes total sense when you think about how social sevens are often described. Charismatic, enthusiastic, able to paint this compelling picture of the future. And boy, can they be persuasive, especially when they truly believe in the cause.
Exactly. And the source makes it clear this wasn't just Oppenheimer being a natural-born leader, though he certainly had that. It also highlights how this drive to take charge, to be the one who makes things happen, that's another key part of the social seven. It's like they need to be needed, to feel valuable, to prove their worth.
Okay, so we're seeing this pattern emerge.
Yeah.
His idealism, need for validation, leadership, all these social seven traits, they're all tangled up in Oppenheimer's story. But then the source goes on to this other thing that really struck me. His relationship with freedom.
Oh, yeah. And this is something Naranjo talks about a lot, this inherent tension within social sevens, this deep-seated need for freedom and autonomy, but also this equally strong desire for connection and validation. It's a delicate balance they're constantly trying to strike.
So how did that actually play out for Oppenheimer? Because let's be real, the Manhattan Project, for all its intellectual freedom, it was also incredibly high stakes, demanding, the pressure was immense.
It was, and that's where this tension we're talking about, it really comes to the surface. The source material talks about how Oppenheimer, he was thriving in this environment of like pure intellectual exploration, but he also felt the weight of it all,
Yeah.
not just the scientific breakthroughs, but the lives on the line, the potential consequences, the whole shebang.
It's like he was constantly walking this tightrope between craving that independence and carrying this massive burden of responsibility.
hmm
And it makes you think, how much did that internal tug-of-war fuel his later activism, speaking out against the very thing he'd been a part of?
Oh, man, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Was it purely about making amends for what he'd done, like some historians say? Or was there this other element, this need to reclaim his sense of autonomy,
Hmm.
pushing back against the system that, let's be honest, had put him in an impossible position?
And we have to remember the context here, too, the Red Scare. Oppenheimer's loyalty and integrity are being questioned. His whole world is turned upside down. The source material really dives into how he navigated that whole ordeal. The pressure must have been unimaginable.
It's pretty remarkable when you think about it, because even with everything on the line, I mean, they stripped him of his security clearance, threatened to ruin his reputation. He never completely cracked.
Right.
He fought back against those accusations, of course, but he also, held on to a certain amount of dignity throughout the whole thing.
Which, knowing what we know about social sevens, makes a lot of sense. It wasn't just about saving face. It was about staying true to that core need for validation,
Hmm.
to be seen as good, as worthy.
Exactly. He wasn't going to let those accusations, baseless as they were, completely define him. He was determined to, at least in some way, control the narrative, to present himself as a man of principle, even in the face of, overwhelming adversity.
And it's fascinating because Oppenheimer's legacy, it's this mix of brilliance and these incredibly heavy consequences.
For sure.
But it's also a story about resilience, about facing these internal struggles, and ultimately trying to use his influence to create a more peaceful future.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes this whole exploration through the Enneagram so insightful. It's not about making excuses or simplifying his story, but it gives us a framework to understand those deeper motivations, the internal struggles that made him who he was.
It's about the why behind the what.
Exactly.
And hopefully it gets us thinking about our own patterns, right? Our own relationship with idealism,
Yep.
responsibility, how much validation we need. Because at the end of the day, that's what a deep dive like this is all about. It's not just about one man's journey. It's about understanding something fundamental about what it means to be human.
I totally agree.
So to everyone listening, if Oppenheimer's story has resonated with you, the triumphs, the tragedies, the sheer weight of his legacy, take a minute to reflect on what it stirs up for you personally. How do you deal with those big questions of responsibility? How do you balance your own ambitions with your values? Because ultimately that's the power of digging into these stories.